Next agenda item is the Lower Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Hydrological Modeling Project. Roger Copp is going to be providing an update on that. So the purpose of this is to provide the second year update on the progress of the Lower Charlotte Harbor Flatwood Hydrological Restoration Project. This relates to hydrologic restoration priority actions and specifically on data collection, modeling, and analyses of historical, current, and projected hydrologic conditions, and to identify needs and guide hydrologic restoration. So with that, Roger, feel free to take the floor.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Roger.
Good, all right. All right, we're in the process right now of doing the scenario analysis, and we wanted to share some of our initial findings with you. The presentation will kind of give an overall summary of some of the project goals and some of the background information, and then we'll move into the scenario analysis phase. So next slide. The study area is the Lower Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods area, and on the north is County Route 74, Vermont Road. That's the horizontal black line you can see at the top of the screen. The vertical black line that's sort of underneath the legend is State Route 31. East of State Route 31 is the Babcock Ranch area. West of State Route 31 is Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, which is a primary focus of our study. The model includes the areas south down to the Caloosahatchee River, including Cape Coral, but we are primarily focused with the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area and the Yuca Pens Wildlife Management Area, but we include the other features to sort of help us make sure that we don't have any boundary issues. All right, next slide. This is a aerial photograph of an area that we're calling the South Walk-In area of Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area. And the water levels you're seeing here are typical that you would see during the summer. On the lower portion of the photograph is some land that is grazed land. That's outside of that's south of the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, and you can see a road that sort of runs along north of that at angles. That's called the South Walk-In Woods Road, the next slide is kind of zoomed in area. These areas that are circled are areas that are north of the south boundary, are classified in land use files as being upland, but yet you see standing water in these areas during the summer. I'll be talking about that later on in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, big picture. The blue outlined area is the South Walk-In area. It's called the South Walk-In area because in the summertime, the only way to get in there is to walk or be on a swamp buggy. Water is ponded in this area during the summer season because of numerous impediments to flow. The Bond Farm, which is currently now owned by the state, but prior to that was a farm. It had a berm all the way around it, and so that prevented water from flowing to the southwest. The Stoley Ranch has a berm across its northern boundary, which restricted flows. West of 41, a number of developments have berms around them. Southwest Aggregates, McNew, Heron's Glen, all have berms around them that restrict flow heading to the southwest. As a result, the only way for water to get through that area is to flow through the middle of Bond Farm. There's a remnant ditch that goes through the middle that is not connected and not part of the farm. and water will flow through there south into Prairie Pines Preserve, which is on the west side of I-75. And for those reasons, water is held up in Babcock Webb. What we're considering, what we developed as a conceptual plan as part of the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative back in, I don't know, 2015 or so, was a concept to purchase the Bond Farm, turn it into a water storage area, and then convey water from Babcock Webb into Bond Farm during the wet season, and then subsequently release that water and send it west along that purple line alignment over towards the Yuca Pens. We have the Bond Farm, as I mentioned. It's been designed. At some point it will get constructed. But currently the plan is to send that water south because we do not have easements in place to get the water west over towards Yuca Pens. We believe we can get the easements either through the aggregates or McNew, but getting it from US 41 over to the Yuca Pens is proving to be a challenge. Next slide. Zooming in on the South Walk-in area, we have a number of monitoring stations in there. And the photograph on the left shows what the water levels are like during the wet season. Hydro periods are longer than are considered optimum. Next slide. We're looking at trying to restore hydrology in the Yuca Pens as well. The Yuca Pens is too dry. As Mike Kemmer said to me back in 2010, geez, Roger, if we could get all the excess water we have in Babcock Webb over to Yuca Pens would be a lot better. At that point, while I was working for another firm, we were working on designing some channel blocks for ATV ditches that were highly eroded. And so what we're going to be hoping to do here is to continue that effort of blocking off places where water is leaving the site too quickly. The red lines are places where we're proposing to put berms. We're also proposing to evaluate all the isolated wetlands and make sure that there aren't any locations or eroded ATV trails that drain the isolated wetlands. And we're also potentially going to put water in, or we're going to put a weir in Zemel Canal. You can see the red number 1 at the top of the screen there. We're looking at that. Want to point out that Bear Branch and Hog Branch, much of the watershed for those two branches is outside of state-owned land. And so our ability to hold water back and restore hydrology to those creeks, which discharge to tidal waters, is limited by the available land that is within state ownership. So we're not going to likely be able to have huge changes or significant changes in terms of flows to tide that we would like to achieve. Next slide. This is looking through kind of the central area of Babcock Webb, or excuse me, Yuca Pens. I want to point out a couple of things that will come up in discussion. The red lines, again, are berms or low water fords that we're proposing to put in at various locations. And I want to point out the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in black text that you can see there. Number 1 is something called the YP6 area. There are some eroded ATV trails that are draining that area. I'll show you those in a minute. Number 2 is Durden Creek at what is called Station SR9. We have a monitoring station there. And then Yuca Pens Creek at location number 3 is there's a monitoring station at SR8 there. You'll see references to that later in the presentation. A typical low water ford that we're proposing to put in is shown in the cross section on the left. All right, next slide. This is a photograph of that eroded ATV trail. It flows pretty much all summer long. This is near a monitoring well, YP6, and the monitoring data from YP6 shows that wetlands upstream of this area don't have enough water on them because of these accelerated flows hitting the tide during the wet season via these ATV trails. Next slide. The south part of Yuca Pens borders Gator Slough, which is sort of the boundary between Cape Coral to the south and Yuca Pens Wildlife Management Area to the north. We have done some work in this area here. In the past, ATV channel blocks were put in 2013. A low water ford, you can see a photograph on the left, was installed as part of that effort. And we saw some hydrologic and ecologic response. Just north of where you see the word ATV2, you see a wetland area. That was rarely wet in 2010, and now it has much more normal wetland hydro periods because of the ATV blocks and the improvements that we made in 2013. We did not make as many improvements as we wanted to back then because of funding limits. So there's more to be done, and we're proposing some additional weirs. We're also looking into some sort of implementation to reduce seepage to Gator Slough. Ground elevations in the south part of Yuca Pens are in the neighborhood of 14 to 15 feet. Gator Slough in this area is maintained at an elevation of around 7. So there's about a 7-foot differential there, and that has a draining effect upon the groundwater of the southern part of Yuca Pens. We've considered a cutoff wall. I think the cutoff wall, is being done down in the Miami-Dade area, is going to be too expensive. But there's another approach where we drill wells spaced, say, 10 feet apart, and then pump concrete into the wells, and the concrete oozes out into the rock that's underground, and that forms a partial barrier. It would still let a fair amount of water through, but it would reduce seepage rates. And so that's one of the things we're considering. Next slide. We're, like I mentioned, we're in the scenario analysis phase. The first thing was to do a natural pre-development model, and then we're looking at 3 future condition scenarios. For the pre-development model, we started with a land use file that Mike Kemmer and Tim Lieberman created, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Our goal is to restore hydrology to the greatest extent possible. We're not going to achieve full restoration. South walk-in is too wet. Hydro periods in Yuca Pens are too short. Wet season depths are too low in the south and the west. Our questions are, will the Bond Farm storage area be sufficient to correct the hydro period issues in the south walk-in? Initially, we would like to, our plan had been to send water to Yuca Pens, but because of access issues, getting easements, that may be very, very expensive. And so maybe if we can restore hydrology just by blocking off all the eroded ATV trails, we can restore Yuca Pens hydrology, and we can forget about sending water across US 41. In that case, we'd send water south to the Caloosahatchee to aid in the dry season salinity issues that many folks are working on trying to address. So next slide. I mentioned that we're going to start with a land use file that Kemmer and Lieberman prepared, and our targets are going to be to restore hydrology to optimum conditions that have been defined by Mike Duver. He's done work in Babcock Webb and Yuca Pens before, and he does quite a bit of work down in the cypress swamps in southern Lee County and Collier. So we're looking to get water depths in the cypress systems in Yuca Pens in the 12 to 18-inch range. We'd like to see wet prairies in Babcock Webb be in the 6 to 12-inch range. We'd like cypress hydroperiods to be 6 to 8 months. We'd like marshes hydroperiods to be 6 to 10 months. We'd like the wet prairie hydroperiods to be 2 to 6 months. So these are our targets. Next slide. When Kemmerer and Lieberman did their work, what they did is they looked at a variety of different types of information and create a land use file representing pre-development conditions for using 1953 photographs. And they ranked the 4 different land use categories as basically ranks, hydrologic ranks 1 through 4. Hydrologic rank 1 being dry or a mesic flatwood. Hydrologic rank 4 would be wet, either a cypress or a marsh, and then 2 intermediate hydrologic conditions. And the hydroperiods are shown. The average wet season water depths are shown. These are our targets. Next slide. So what Kemmerer and Lieberman did was stitch together a bunch of aerial photographs from 1953, and then used some soils maps, and a lot of looking at the aerial photographs and a lot of local knowledge to come up with a land use map with these 4 hydrologic ranks shown in the image to the right. The yellow areas being the dry upland areas, and the darker blue areas being the areas that are wet most of the time. Next slide. So here's some simulation results. What we did is we ran the model for a 10-year period, and then calculated what the average wet season water depth was for July 1 through October 15th. And the darker blue areas are deeper waters. The yellow areas are relatively shallow waters, 0.1 to 0.5 feet in deep depth. The white areas are average wet season water depths of below 0 or below 0.1 foot. And you can see that that red arrow pointing to the southern end of the South Walk-In should have some water in it during the wet season. And it's possible that we have some topo issues. We did a fair amount of survey transects to correct topography in the South Walk-In because all of the really wet areas, the topo was off by about 1.5 feet. The LiDAR cannot penetrate water. But more work, I think, is going to be needed in the future to fully define what's going on in that area. So this will be a conservative analysis. There's quite a bit of water in the South Walk-In area. Next slide, please. Here's some average wet season water depth maps for Yuca Pens. The one on the top is zoomed in to basically looking at the Yuca Pens and Durden Creek watersheds. The pink outline areas are cypress, and the depths again range from greater than 2 feet of depth in very dark blue to 1/10 of a foot to 1/2 a foot depth in yellow. And cypress, there should be 1 to 2 feet of water, and we don't have that in the cypress systems here. The water depths are too low. In the south part of Yuca Pens that we're calling the ATV area, you can see a lot of white. There are marshes in that white area that are not really marshes. They would like to be marshes. At least I think so. They haven't really told me that, but the water levels in these marshes are much lower than they should be. And so this represents our challenges. Next slide. What we did is we took the information from this analysis that we did of hydroperiods and then looked at for different areas, what did the simulation results tell us? And in the top left graph shows the South Walk-In area, and you can see the dark blue line is the hydrologic rank number 4, and the hydroperiods are 10 to 12 months. They're higher than desired. In the ATV area on the lower left, you'll see hydroperiods for the for hydrologic rank 3 and 4 are generally less than 5 months. So that area is too dry. In the cypress areas, the hydro periods are in the 5 to 6 month range, and we'd like to see them, in the 6 to 8 month range. So those represent our challenges. Next slide, please. So in the South Walk-In, we want to go from existing hydro period of around 9.5 months down to 8 months. We're looking to reduce hydro periods by 1.5 months or so. In the cypress, we're looking to add a couple of months of hydro period. In the south part of Yuca Pens in the ATV area, we'd like to add about 4 months of hydro period. And we'd like to add water depths as well, about 1 foot in the Yuca Pens area, where the modeling results don't show that we need to change water depths in the South Walk-In area, but because of topographic issues, we're thinking that may not be spot on. Next slide, please. So here's a simulation map showing hydro period for a 2 month or a 2 year period. This is a difference map. So this is scenario 1 minus baseline. And in scenario 1, we put in these low water forwards. We've put in a sort of seepage barrier across the south end. And you can see these areas that are green. These are areas where we're seeing, depending upon how dark the green is, a 1 to 3 month increase in wetland hydro periods. And in the areas that you can see that are blue, like near the YP6 area, we're seeing a hydro period response greater than 4 months, and we're seeing some hydro period response greater than 4 months in the south part of Yuca Pens. So we're moving in the right direction in terms of our restoration. I want to point out 2 spots that I'm going to discuss on the next slide. You can see the letter Y in Yuca Pens Creek, and you can see the letter D further to the east. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So let's go to the next slide, please. So on the top is, I just picked a representative spot where we are proposing to hold more water on the landscape. And you can see that we're extending the hydro periods. The blue line is existing. The red line is proposed. The green line is sort of the typical elevation or ground elevation in the cypress, and the orange line is the sort of the edge of the cypress. So we're increasing water depths and we're increasing hydro periods, and so we're moving in the right direction here. In Yuca Pens, we are seeing the same thing. We're increasing hydro periods, we're increasing water depths, and we're moving towards where we want to get to. And so our scenario 1 results suggest that we are moving in the right direction, and seeing some improved hydrology in Yuca Pens. Next slide, please. Here's a map showing groundwater difference for the water table, and again you're seeing water. These dark blue areas are typically marsh areas that are seeing higher water depths of approximately 1/2 foot or so, which is moving in the right direction. We're not seeing a foot increase, but we're about half the way there. Next slide. Here are some graphs. What we want to do is we want to decrease discharges off of the Yuca Pens, and across the south part of Yuca Pens, there are 2 points where there's flows leaving Yuca Pens and entering Gator Slough. The graph on the top left shows the difference between existing minus proposed. And so anything that's positive means that there's less discharge during proposed conditions than there is under existing conditions. And so we're moving in the right direction. The other thing that we are looking to do is we're looking to reduce peak flow discharges during the wet season to tide. And so the bottom left graph shows Yuca Pens Creek at Burnt Store Road. And the dashed red is the proposed. The blue line is the existing. You can see for a pretty good sized rainfall event, runoff event in July of 2021, we were seeing a 50% reduction. The other thing that was encouraging is we're seeing an extended period of positive discharges to tide after the rainfall events. I'd like to see that further extended, but this is kind of what we're seeing at this point in time with scenario one. The two graphs on the right, Durden Creek on the top, Yuca Pens Creek on the bottom. These are basically sort of at the western edge of Yuca Pens, and we're seeing increased water depths, and we're seeing higher water levels extending into the dry season. And so for those wetlands that are within the Yuca Pens wildlife management area, we're seeing pretty substantial responses, positive responses in water depths. Next slide. We have some construction feasibility issues. Some of the locations, like on the left, there's an existing road that crosses through the cypress, and it will be easy for us to put in a low water ford. It'll be beneficial to the habitat, and it won't have any negative impacts. We won't have to cut down any cypress trees. There are some locations where we're proposing to put in weirs, like an example location on the right, where it's essentially an undisturbed cypress system, and we'll have to do dental work if we're going to try to hold water back in some of these other locations. So we're still evaluating that, and we're hoping to come up with some creative ideas for that. One way would be to just do a boardwalk, which would be great for wildlife viewing and for people that like to walk around in cypress swamps. And we could potentially have some structures, low impact structures on the upstream side that would hold water back. Let's see, let's go to the next slide here. What I did is I took the flows for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different creeks that cross underneath Burnt Store Road. I added up all the flows for existing and proposed. The existing is the blue, and the dashed red is the proposed, and we're seeing peak flow reductions in the 10 to 30%, 40% range. We are not seeing extensive, we're not seeing significant extension of low flow discharges towards the end of the year. And so we haven't gotten exactly where I want to get to, because I know Corey listened to his presentation earlier, and I've listened to him talk before. I know that the fish biologists would like to see more flows during the dry season and less peak flows during the wet season. So we're moving in the right direction during the wet season, but we haven't. I don't think we've satisfied Corey yet. So Corey, I'm still thinking about you, buddy. We're working in that direction. So next slide. What we're seeing is on top is the baseline, on the bottom is the scenario for the hydrologic rank number 3, the light blue. We're seeing an area that I've highlighted. So we have a greater number of cells within our model that are seeing improved wetland hydro periods. And we see the same thing in the cypress systems. We're now typically in the 7 to 8 month, 6 to 8 month range for the cypress. So we're really getting pretty close in the cypress systems. Next slide. ATV, we're moving in the right direction. You can see the zoomed in view for the hydrologic rank number 4 areas. These are the really wet areas. And we're seeing the blue is existing, the red is the proposed. So everything is sort of shifting to the right to increased wetland hydro periods. So again, moving in the right direction. Next slide. We have put Bond Farm into scenario 1. We are storing water in Bond Farm. The plan is to store 4 feet of water there. It's a 600 acre foot storage area. So we're storing 2,400 acre feet. What we're not seeing is a whole lot of response in Babcock Webb. That highlighted area with the yellow or the red circle that is yellow, that indicates the water depth change decreased less than 0.5 feet. And on average is about a 0.12 foot drop in water levels. So we have to take more water off of Babcock Webb in order to achieve our restoration goals. So we need another tank, in essence, to make it very simple. We need a bigger bathtub that we can take water and put water into during the wet season in order to restore the hydrology in the south part of Yuca Pens. And so that leads us to our next slide. Where do we go next? Scenario 1, I just talked about it. We moved Babcock Webb into Bond. We blocked ATV trails in the Yuca Pens. We did not, as part of scenario 1, plan for the outflows from Bond to go over into Yuca Pens. Our questions prior to beginning the alternatives analysis was, if we had a limited response in the South Walk-in area, then we would need more storage. Well, we clearly need more storage. We said if there was a limited response in Yuca Pens, consider a seepage barrier in the south part of Yuca Pens. We've already incorporated that to some degree. So now the next step is scenario 2, and we're in the process of formulating scenario 2 literally as we speak. I'm not doing it right now because I'm talking to you, but prior to getting on the call, I was working on scenario 2, our team is working on that. So we need to store more water, and so a possibility is the Southwest Aggregates mine west of 75, east of 41. Another possibility is Stoley Ranch. I showed the location of that earlier in a presentation. However, Stoley he's willing to sell to the state, but not at a price that the state is willing to spend. But we're going to at least in this scenario, because it's just a scenario, it's not like I'm going to write a check and buy the Stoley property from them. We're going to run this scenario. We're going to store some water in Stoley. We're going to store some water in Babcock in Southwest Aggregates and see if that has a positive response. At this point, I'm not sure if we really need to do the flowway west over towards Yuca Pens. We've had pretty good hydroperiod response, a pretty good water depth response in Yuca Pens. Given the challenge that we're going to have in acquiring easements to get water to Yuca Pens, I'm not so sure that makes sense, but we haven't made a decision on that. We're probably going to put it in the simulation just so we see what effect it has, but it may not be feasible for us to deliver water to Yuca Pens from Bond Farm. Our final scenario will be basically taking scenario 2 and adding climate change to that. So that's where we're at right now. I see there was a question and there was an answer. And yes, the answer is we're looking primarily at what I would call a low water forward, or one could call it a weir. That's our primary plan. That's what we have done in the past. Where there are relatively small ATV trails, we'll just put in a channel block. But when you get to larger flows, our experience is the channel blocks get washed out or get bypassed. And so we need something a little bit more substantial. And these things that we're proposing will I think, help FWC in their management efforts of the wildlife management area. And they could also be a benefit to folks that like to get around into the wildlands, either in the wet or the dry season. So the low water fords or maybe potentially the boardwalks with, some sort of structure on the upstream side of it. Those are the sort of things we're thinking about. Open to any questions.
Roger, what was the actual question you were just answering there?
That was from, let's see here. It was from Joey White.
Okay. I'm just going to read that aloud let me see if I can find it for people in the room.
I can read it. I got it right here.
Great, thank you.
I apologize if this was answered earlier in the presentation. I had to step away for a minute, but how are you controlling the water? I know you mentioned the area has plenty of berms, but how are you getting increased water levels, hydro periods, just through berm removal, weir construction? Okay, there's kind of a combination question there. In Babcock Webb, we can't really remove berms because the berms were built by others, and it's not like you can just go into someone's land and say, "Hey, dude, I'm going to cut your berm down and flood your land." Can't really do that. So the excess water that we're going to get off of Babcock Webb, we're going to have to do that by creating flowways to bypass private lands, or we're going to have to store the water. And because generally speaking, North Fort Myers doesn't want to have any extra water in the wet season. And generally speaking, I don't think lands west of 75 want to see more water during the wet season. I think, this is just my personal opinion, that we need more storage. We should be storing that water during the wet season so that we can use it beneficially in the dry season. In Yuca Pens, the problem in Yuca Pens is erosion via ATV trails, that we need to block those ATV trails to hold more water on the landscape. And so we're proposing to do that through a variety of approaches. One is just ATV channel blocks, which is a very simple thing. You put some dirt in, you stabilize it with some rock, or the more substantial ways to hold water are low water forts, which we have implemented before. They work well. And so those are our primary tools that we're planning to utilize.
Thank you, Roger. I think we're running a little tight on time, so I think we've got time for one more question if somebody's got one.
Yep, Roger, this is Dave Blue with FWC. I got a question about, I saw the presentation, you did this presentation at the Flatwoods last meeting. And I remember in that presentation, there were issues with water going around the fords and the weirs and all those things. And that was going to be a potential issue. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. One of the things that we have, I've talked about with the FWC staff is they do, in order for them to manage the property, they drive around the perimeter on a frequent basis. And so they essentially have sort of a pathway that runs along the property line. There are places where those property lines are low, and we're having water leaving in those areas. And so one of the things that they have already tried to do and had success with this is sort of blocking off those low-lying areas along the perimeter. And so what we have done in the model is we've put in some features in the model to allow us to control overland flow outside of the Mike 11, sort of outside of the defined flowways. And we've been able to reduce it some. We're still refining. We have clearly some water bypassing the structures. So we're working on that.
thank you again, Roger. Great presentation.